how he wanted to be introduced. He said he wanted to be introduced as someone who was old enough to be a jaded ex-investment banker, still young enough to be appointed a young noble leader, but I forget by whom, so you have to, you have to specify that. Please, Tony, the floor is yours.
Thanks for having me, and I'm not going to go into the details of what was said. Now, I just want to go and take the discussion a little bit more general, because it has so far been a lot about corruption, and to some extent about a lot of what happens in developing countries. And I want to start by saying that the opposite of good governance is not corruption, but it's much more complex. The opposite of good governance is incompetence in many instances. It's a lack of institutions and context. It's a lack of trust in societies. As we know, there are high trust societies and low trust societies. And, of course, it's also corruption. And I think that whole context is really important. How does human nature interact with the societal settings, be it whether you are talking about your village, your community, you're talking about your country, you're talking about the company you work for, and how you relate to all of these ways of organizing society and economic and social activity are all very, very important to the idea of good governance. And this varies across the board, across countries. So I just want to give you an example. The fact of the matter is there's loads and loads of studies which have now clearly shown that we are all a bit dishonest. And in fact, there's an excellent book that I recommend which is called Why or How We Lie to Ourselves. And as it turns out, we all are very comfortable cheating, but only within the extent that we can justify to ourselves that it's not really cheating. One way of thinking about it, if you've seen the advertisement for Dove, I think, is I'm worth it. So there are ideas that run the spectrum. If you're an investment banker, you're a trader, as I once used to be, whenever you make a profit, it's down to your skill. Whenever there's a loss, it's the market or something else has happened. There was this earthquake in Japan that you couldn't anticipate. And most of the time, we lie to ourselves. And there's always this nice rationalization. So it has been shown in many experiments that left to themselves people with money in the room, people who are able to claim rewards for things they haven't done, they all lie comfortably. And these are all honest, straightforward people like you and I. And I participated in one of these experiments, and I did too. Within an extent of about plus minus 20–30%. So if you are entitled to $10, you think it's okay to get 13 or 14, right? But to get to 100, you need to be sort of psychopathic. So most people have an internal sense of regulation, self-regulation. There's this fundamental idea of, we're all nice people. We like to think of ourselves, and with a few exceptions, most people do. And they justify it. Which is why institutions, incentives, and cultures, and examples all around you are amazingly important, because we have this intrinsic streak to do things that are not necessarily completely appropriate. And that is important to remember. What's also interesting here is the way some of this manifests itself. So there was an Israeli kindergarten in Tel Aviv, and the people who ran the kindergarten noticed the parents were supposed to come and pick up their kids around 6 p.m. and they were always late, sometimes 6:30, sometimes 7, and sometimes, like in extreme circumstances, 7:30. And they were frustrated because that meant that these people had to stay beyond their working hours because they can't leave the kids alone. So they decided to do, the naturally intuitive thing that you and I would think about and say, well, we're going to have fines. If you don't pick up your kids by 6 o'clock, we're going to impose a fine. And lo and behold, what happened was that after they instituted the fine, the parents, instead of coming at 6:30 or 6:45, started coming at 7, 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 9:30, and 10. And what had happened is the fundamental nature of that transaction had changed from something which was cultural, where there was this sense of obligation, to something which actually was tradable, something that could be bought with money. And there's a fantastic book by a friend of mine, Jonathan Sandel, and I forgot the name, but it looks at how the marketization of things that were not actually tradable, things you couldn't buy, is corrupting the nature of society, is corrupting and fundamentally changes the nature of that interaction. Which is why often people say, you shouldn't really lend money or borrow money from friends. I mean, there's a fundamental good reason for that. And that's really interesting. And this is interesting, this idea of, the minute you put a money value on something, it changes the fundamental way you perceive it, is important. Because for the most part, if you get caught with corruption, when companies get caught, when Siemens got caught, for example, if you get caught having missold financial products, as most of the large investment banks did, if you get caught facilitating tax avoidance and tax evasion, as the big Swiss bank UBS did, where a banker was smuggling diamonds in a toothpaste in order to allow his American clients to avoid taxes, you end up paying a financial penalty. And in fact, it's not you, it's not even the company, it's the shareholders of the firm. So there are huge financial fines that are levied, but there are 1 or 2 steps removed from the people who actually did it. And the minute you put financial value, it becomes a cost of doing business. In the same way that it used to be, as Jonathan was saying, in the good old days before the World Bank and international institutions started cracking down on corruption, it was assumed that for most developing country transactions, whenever you went to Africa, whenever, there was a 5–10% premium which had to be paid as bribes. It was simply regarded as a cost of doing business. I remember I was driving around in Nepal at the time of the Maoist insurgency, and it was fantastic. So the Maoists had erected all these barriers around various parts of rural Nepal. And every time they stopped you, especially if you were a foreign NGO, they made you pay money, but they gave you a receipt. And it was really, really interesting that it was to all intents and purposes bribes you were paying in order to facilitate your way through, be it in business or to try and deliver aid. And this is the reality that many international organizations face every day. But they gave you a receipt, and you could go back home and actually tell either the World Bank or the UN or ActionAid or Oxfam that, hey guys, I paid this, but this is what I paid. And you could actually get a deduction. In many countries, you can actually still essentially claim all of these facilitations, which are shades of grey. And I think that you gave fantastic examples of how everything, as innocuous as scholarships for children, like what's wrong with that? Who can be against that? To business trips to see the facilities you're going to be doing business with are actually potentially corruptible, and in reality do get corrupted. It's all a very slippery slope. Who is to say whether the consulting services you are paying me for are actually worth the $500,000 I'm charging you, or are they worth $200,000, or are they worth $100,000? And the largest channel for money-changing hands, for bribery, for tax being avoided, are is basically this channel where you misreport how much something cost. The examples I use of the diamonds in the toothpaste is one. There were several examples done by a friend of mine called Raymond Baker, who looked at trade transactions with many African countries and found that there were toothbrushes worth $1,000 being imported into Nigeria. There were crocodile skins for about $500,000 or something. And this sort of stuff is really hard to detect, particularly as trade moves away from trade in goods, where you can still, something you can touch, something you can feel. This speaker, I know if somebody was charging me $1 million for this speaker, I know there's a problem, right? But if somebody said, I'm doing consulting services, I've just designed a new patent, or I'm designing an iPhone and this is how much I'm going to charge, it's really hard to actually say whether something is worth $1 million or not. And so many channels, as the amount of global trade increases, as the trade shifts away from goods into services, as supply chains become more complex, so you're not trading finished goods anymore, but you're trading all the millions of parts that go into the iPhone, which don't actually have a market price. It becomes much easier to pay and receive bribes. And we have seen, at least until just before the financial crisis, a significant increase in the scale of this sort of corruption, which is really, really pernicious. Now, historically, corruption was something you normally identify with, and this is the way we spoke about it in the developed world in a high and mighty and rather conceited way. It was something to do with developing countries, but I think that myth is something we can no longer hide behind, and you used fantastic examples demonstrating, including from the OECD report, how corruption is pernicious across all kinds of societies, not just in Africa, not just in India, not just in Latin America, but equally in Europe. If you've been following what's going on in Greece, Greece is a country supposedly in the developed world, in the European Union, which has a huge corruption problem, which is a huge problem where people don't pay taxes. And that has led to, and you can see clearly for yourself, the economic cost, the social cost, the human cost of corruption, of bad governance, of incompetence. And again, it's not a developing country problem anymore. What has historically also been the case is that while, if you go to the Indian Finance Ministry and you try and speed up the how quickly your application is going to be processed for a license, and you pay a few thousand rupees or you engineer a foreign trip, that is corruption, that's bribery, that you crack down on that, you judge. But the bank account in Switzerland, where the money goes, is okay. If you were a suit and you're then corrupt, you're okay. If you're corrupt, not in the tens of thousands of rupees, but we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, you're okay. There was an air of respectability. There still is far too much of it in the city of London, in Switzerland, in New York, in the state of Delaware, in the United States, because for every bribe taker, there is a bribe payer. In almost every single major case of corruption that has been discussed and discovered in Greece, there is a German company behind that. And this is when Germany is pronouncing judgments on how corrupt Greece is. Behind every single exchange of payment or implicit or explicit bribe, there are facilitators, and they wear pinstripe suits, and they're called accountants, and they're called bankers, and they're called tax advisors. KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, all these names that you hear of, the big four accounting firms, are the world's largest purveyors of aggressive tax avoidance strategies. And they are amongst the most profitable line of business for these firms. The only goal is how is it that I can help reduce the tax that those who should be, who are most capable of paying tax, all the large multinational firms, the big banks, rich people, plutocrats, how can we make sure that they don't pay their taxes? Now the impact of this goes beyond what is not paid, because, again, going back to human nature, we are social animals, and we have clear rules, and we look at what is common behavior, a part that was something that was referred to earlier. What is the benchmark? What is acceptable normal behavior? And if you live in a society where you see the billionaires, the people with the big houses, the people with the big cars, not paying their fair share, and you are much further down the ladder of society, you are very much not likely to want to pay either. There is something in criminology which is called the 60-20-20 rule, which essentially says 20% of the people will always cheat. 20% of the people will never cheat, and 60% will cheat if they think others are cheating. And that is why it is so important, and it is so corrosive. And that is why you have to some extent, follow the so-called broken window strategy with corruption. And this broken window strategy was a criminal theory tried out in New York, where they said that crime is a slippery slope. What starts with a small crime then becomes a bigger crime unless it's checked. So what they started doing was every time somebody just sprayed graffiti on a wall that graffiti should not be on, or somebody broke a window, you would instantly try and punish them, and you would repair the damage so it didn't look broken. If you went to a housing estate which has several broken windows, burnt out car, etc., you'd expect it to be high crime. And studies have shown that actually the crime rate does increase. So this broken windows theory of corruption says nothing, there is no such thing as petty corruption. And it has got to be checked at its root. And that means we have to tackle the whole spectrum from small pernicious behavior. Which one of us hasn't taken office supplies from the office, right? I mean, it's one of the most common things where you go to your school where public property essentially becomes the public's property. And it starts small. I'm not saying you're all going to end up as, end up behind bars for grand corruption and bring down countries with bridges that were not well built. But it's important to be self-conscious. It's important to know we are flawed individuals. It's important to know our peer group matters. It's important to know what the norms of behavior around you are. And this means that no simple understanding of corruption, no simple understanding of governance, no simple understanding of the kind we used to have. These are good governance societies. Norway, for example, is obviously, always comes at the top of all corruption lists as being amongst the least corrupt, most well-governed country, etc. That all of these distinctions actually are not really true. Let me give you an example. This is a problem. Iceland actually is an interesting example. Until the financial crisis, the top 5 countries in Transparency International, all sorts of anti-corruption indices, almost always used to include Iceland, right? And I don't know how many of you followed the details of what happened in Iceland, but basically, it was a kleptocratic elite, highly connected to each other, who knew each other because they all went to the same school and so on and so forth, or hung out in the same clubs, who have single-handedly, between maybe 30 of them, brought down a whole country to its knees. Iceland still has capital controls. Iceland still has levels of welfare much below what they were 6 or 7 years back. Now Norway, and this is possibly a warning, is also a small country where the Prime Minister and the head of the bank go to the same university, text each other on mobile phone numbers in the middle of the government rescuing Norway's biggest bank. The fact of the matter is that some of these people are best men at each other's wedding. And nepotism and corruption are not of the kind that happen in developing countries. There are no suitcases of cash exchanging hands in Norway, as far as I know. But who you know still matters much more, even in a country like Norway, than what you know. And as long as that is the case, there is work to be done. You cannot have a truly open, competitive, liberal society where people get rewarded for their efforts and talent. You cannot have a society which meets its economic and social potential as long as problems remain, all the way from suitcases under the table to hiring people you know or you like rather than on the basis of their competence. And the cost of our continuing lack of self-awareness, our continuing misunderstanding of what good governance is all about are enormous. But there's a new generation, you people, and we hope that tomorrow's society is less corrupt, is better governed, is more competent, and offers talent, offers all of us the opportunity to be the best we can be, and everybody else will benefit. Thank you so much.